My name is Matthijs, and together with my partner Egge, I'm going to take you through our build model about process of individual and duo motor learning. So what are we going to talk about? First, we will start with a brief introduction about the topic. Then we will provide you with some background information about some important concepts. And after that, we propose our model and show you several simulations. And lastly, in the discussions, our research questions will be addressed and answered. So first, what exactly is motor learning? Motor learning basically enables humans and animals to gain new skills, or it improves the accuracy and smoothness of an action. So as you can imagine, motor learning has huge practical relevance for example, babies, injured people, dancers, musicians, sporters. Many scientists conducted research on the topic, and several factors have been identified that influence the process of motor learning, which made it interesting for us to look at. And two main factors that were identified were the level of practice and the level of motivation. These two factors sort of imply a personal and behavioral influence, so therefore this also became our focus. Some background information about the influencing concepts will follow. Based on this, the aim of this research is to contribute to the psychological knowledge in motor learning by helping to understand how people with certain personalities, alone and in pairs, are being influenced by several factors during their motor learning process. In order to reach this aim, two main research questions are formulated as follows. How do different individual dynamics influence the performance in motor learning of an individual? And how do duo dynamics influence the performance in motor learning of an individual? So briefly some background information. Here two definitions are presented with regard to motor learning. It's not necessary to read them, but they both imply the importance of practice, stated in orange. And on top of that, by using the word permanent on the one hand and automatic on the other hand, stated in yellow, they sort of similarly imply that motor learning is something that is long-lasting. When you do something automatically, it often means that it's something long-lasting. Regarding motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation exists. Extrinsic motivation is motivated, motivation initiated by external rewards such as money, fame, or job titles. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is the desire of an individual to perform the task for its own sake, basically. However, a so-called undermining effect exists between the two, which means that rewards, so the extrinsic motivation, are often counterproductive because they undermine intrinsic motivation. An example of this can be described by a boy who is intrinsically motivated to clean up his room because it's a mess, and during the cleaning his mother comes along and tells him he earns €5 for doing the job. And after hearing this, his initial intrinsic motivation of the child now becomes sort of undermined, making the intrinsic motivation less influential. Also, some different types of learning or practice exist. These are auditory, kinesthetic, and visual learning. However, they are not part of this presentation due to time constraints. And in addition, the confidence and acquirable skill belief also exist, which have an influence. However, because of the same reason, we will not discuss them elaborately. They are discussed elaborately in our paper. Based on this theoretical background, we listed several questions per research question. The relevant ones are for now stated in bold. So Egge, you can click on. For the first question, this is how do intrinsic and extrinsic motivation each influence the performance in motor learning? And for the second questions, these are how do different motivation levels in duo learning influence the performance in motor learning? And how does competitiveness influence the performance in motor learning? And now we'll give the presentation to Egge.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself and something happened. But we are going into our model now, and we'll go step by step. At first, we have the central aspect of our model, which is the performance of this particular motor skill. This is influenced by the practice. You can see this, how the person practices the skill or how much he practices it. How much you practice it in our model is directly influenced by the motivation, so how much you want to do it. And as said previously, this motivation consists of two parts, which is the extrinsic and the intrinsic motivation. Both of them influence the motivation, but there's also an undermining effect from the extrinsic motivation to the intrinsic motivation. In our model, the extrinsic motivation is influenced by the performance of the person. So how better you are at it, how more extrinsic motivation, for example, money, you will receive to do it. And it also, the performance also influences the intrinsic motivation through confidence. So how better you get at something, the more confident you get, the more intrinsic motivation you will get. And the extra parts, which are, for example, overconfidence, acquirable skill belief, and visualizing, are also parts of our model, but because the previously mentioned time constraints, we are not going deeper into this. So this is the one-person model. We also created a two-person model, which is basically the same model, but then twice. And there are some connections, and the connections exist between the intrinsic motivation of the other person and the performance of the other person. The intrinsic motivation is connected to the intrinsic motivation, and the performance of person two is connected also to the intrinsic, but also to the extrinsic motivation, and we will go deeper into that later. And when you have the two-person model, you will get this 3D model where you see the two persons at the base level. There are some second-order states. These are two states per person. The first state is the weight value between the extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. This is the undermining effect. Our idea behind that is the stronger that they both get, the more prominent the undermining effect is. The second order state is the speed of the performance. Our idea behind this is how better you get at something, how more difficult it is to improve in it. So it's actually, the speed is the inverse of the performance itself. These are the connection and the connection weights. We used some important things. The X2, which is the extrinsic motivation, currently has only one. This is for the one-person model, namely. So this is the one person where the extrinsic motivation only has one weight coming into it. The intrinsic motivation has four weights, which are the confidence, the extrinsic motivation, the acquirable skill belief, and the overconfidence. And in our case, we have a motivation consists of extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation, and it is 20% extrinsic and 80% intrinsic. We believe that intrinsic motivation is more important for the motivation in general, so that's why we chose these values. These are the function parameters we used, for example, for the undermining effect, we do not have a Hebbian function, but a negative Hebbian function because it should undermine it. And yeah, we will not go into these. And this is the base model that we get from our connection. This is the one-person model. These are all the base states. The most important to look at are the light blue one, which is X6, which is the performance, and the yellow one, which is the intrinsic motivation, and the red one, which is not visible, it's the same as the bottom blue one. So the one around 0.9 is basically the same, which is the extrinsic motivation. We will go deeper into this. When we extend the model to a two-person model, you will see these changes. The extrinsic motivation also gets an input from the other person's performance, and we, in the base model, we say that it's 50-50. And the intrinsic motivation, it also gets the performance of the other person and the intrinsic motivation of the other person. So now we'll go through several simulations to see how our research question will be answered. First, we have a single person model where we, in this presentation, will solely focus on the motivation. So in our first simulation, we see If we change the importance of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation going into motivation. So first case, we have that the motivation is 100% intrinsic motivation, one case where it's 50-50, and one case where it's 100% extrinsic, and then we get these three results. Again, the most important thing to look at are the light blue lines, which is the performance. And as we can see, the more extrinsic motivation becomes important, the more the performance increases. This is due to the fact that intrinsic motivation is also affected by the extrinsic motivation negatively. So if the performance increases a lot, both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation increase a lot, but because extrinsic increases a lot, this will again decrease intrinsic motivation. And because extrinsic motivation doesn't have this negative factor, we do not see a decrease in performance in extrinsic motivation. In performance, in the case of extrinsic motivation. So this is the previously mentioned undermining effect. We can see this more prominent in this figure, where we increase the influence of the undermining effect, where we just increase the weight from extrinsic to intrinsic, and we see that this heavily affects the performance. Now we will go into the two-person model. So this is the one-person model, and we add a two-person model where we actually differ two cases. One is a cooperation case, which is that the performance and the intrinsic motivation of the other person influences the intrinsic motivation of the person. And in the other case, we have a competitive case where the performance of the other person influences the extrinsic motivation of the person, which means it only wants to do better because it wants to do better than the other person, not because it wants to improve its own skill. So in the cooperation model, we see we have two different simulations where in the first case, the intrinsic motivation of person two is high, and the second case, the intrinsic motivation of the second person is low. And here we see a good case of an empathy level. So the performance of the second person is in both cases high, but only the intrinsic motivation is low. And you can see this in the first person where its performance is low. And then the competitiveness, so only the link from the performance of the second person to the extrinsic motivation is set to 1, the other two are set to 0. And we see a competitive mindset. With a competitive mindset, we mean that extrinsic motivation is more important. And with a non-competitive mindset, we say that intrinsic motivation is more important. And we see that in a competitive setting, the competitive mindset causes the best performance. And when we combine the two, so when it is a competitive setting, but also a cooperation setting where all the weights values are set to 1, this gives the best performance for the first person. So, yeah. Now let's go into the discussion. So back to the research questions, how do different dynamics influence the performance and motor learning of an individual? We looked into motivation, where both extrinsic and intrinsic motivation have a positive effect, but there is an indirect negative effect on performance by extrinsic, and this is due to the undermining effect. And this picture is the one where only extrinsic was important. So here you don't have this negative feedback. And the second question, how do duodynamics influence performance in motor learning of an individual? So in the first case, the motivation depends on the setting. In the competitive setting, it is important to have a competitive mindset to perform well. And you can see that there it could be an empathy through the intrinsic motivation. In competitiveness, so as said before, a competitive mindset is beneficial in the competitive setting. And if we combine the best of two worlds, so there is cooperation, but also some competitiveness, we will get the best performance out of this. So there are some improvements and future work to our work. So there are more factors that influence performance, but because we didn't have time to increase the model, we didn't see every factor. Some factors are not modeled optimally. For example, the extrinsic motivation, we only assume it is influenced by the performance, but it can be influenced by many other things. And it's difficult to compare the one-person model to the two-person model because they are just actually two different models. So we cannot say that the dual-person model is better than a one-person model. So that was our presentation.